So, think outside the box.
What is the box in the first place?
What does it mean to think? So, when we began to talk about how to share this, we immediately thought about every time we share the myth on creativity and innovation, and we ask people, are they the same or are they different? Every person has their own perspective about that. And it's really, in many ways, the same with think outside the box. People use it in different ways.
Maybe it's, we need to think differently, we need to think bigger. It's sometimes used as just a general guideline. Sometimes it's used as almost a criticism. We got to think more out of the box now.
Yes. So it's just used in positive and negative ways. So we decided, several years ago, we were talking about that particular cliche, and we said, well, what does it look like from the perspective of the 4 innovation styles?
In a sense, from the 4 styles being modifying, where people like to build upon what's come before, and its opposite, exploring, where you like to question assumptions and just discover things as they unfold. Then there's visioning, which is to imagine an ideal future state that you want to work towards, and its opposite, experimenting, where you want to combine different elements and different factors in novel and unique ways to come up with solutions.
So as we looked at, how would we look at think outside the box from the innovation styles perspective, what came to us was, seriously, to think outside the box would be to think in a way that is not your normal habitual pattern. I can relate to that myself very well, because one of my normal habitual patterns is to think from the visioning style. If I need to think creatively or innovatively, doesn't matter. I want to step back, start with a blank slate, go out into the future and start imagining ideally how I want it to be. And so, as I began to practice all 4 styles, the experimenting style is definitely outside of my habitual pattern.
I remember that you would look at experimenting techniques for idea generation and say, do people really get stimulated by this?
Yes, I couldn't even imagine how that helped you to think innovatively. But of course, as I started practicing those other ways of thinking, especially the experimenting, and I started practicing it, I realized, first of all, it is a creative and innovative way of thinking, and it is outside of my box to think that way.
I had the same experience as a facilitator, where I like the more exploring style of thinking, and that's my habitual way of thinking, if you will, letting things unfold, discovering what's going to be around the next corner, questioning assumptions. And for me, the more difficult, out of my box way of thinking was modifying, where I would have to take something and say, well, how do I build upon it? How do I simplify it? How do I put it to another use? How do I improve upon it in some way? And at first I figured, oh, well, I could do that, but I got bored after 5 or 10 minutes. It just wasn't my cup of tea. And yet it was a skill I had to have, because when I was facilitating, I had to make sure that those in the group that liked that way of thinking, that I would offer them ways of working in a particular project that brought that way of thinking out.
Brought out the best.
Brought out the best of those people.
But that was your thinking outside the box. So once we had this realization for ourselves, we find from time to time, and it doesn't always come out, but from time to time when we have people standing around the room according to their styles, and especially if we have a strong exploring group over there, and especially if it's an intact work team and they see the dynamics of how the styles have been working in their team, we like to point out, now, every style can think outside the box. What does outside the box mean? For us, it means thinking outside of your normal habitual habit pattern. So we always like to go to the exploring and say, guess what? Those of you who prefer the exploring style, guess what thinking outside the box it means for you? It means modifying style. It means to think about how you could simplify. How could you improve upon? Consider what are the strengths that you already have that you can build on. And then we like to look to visioning.
Well, actually to the experimenting, let's say.
Oh, yeah.
Where they like to combine things, test things out in stages, make sure, step by step that something's going to work in a larger and larger situation. Okay, what's outside of their box? It's visioning. It's to step into the future, imagine a bold, far-reaching, ideal goal.
Start with a blank slate, whereas experimenting likes to gather all kinds of data and information. Think outside their box is a blank slate.
Right.
Imagination. Imagine what you want.
And so this is where the versatility among all four styles is really a key skill here, so that you can shift from one way of thinking to another, whether it's your opposite or to those that are similar but a little bit different.
Well, I wanted to point out modifying too before we go on. Those who prefer the modifying style, of course, their most opposite is exploring. And sometimes it's a little, well, kind of like me with trying to figure out how to think with experimenting. Sometimes it's a little confusing, how do I think more exploring? And so we help them to see that they can think more exploring by questioning things. Why are we doing it this way? Why are we doing it that way?
For example, in one exercise we give people around redesigning the dashboard of a car. Okay, one of the core assumptions of a dashboard and the mechanisms of driving a car is that the steering wheel is round. So we ask the modified people, suppose for a moment the steering wheel could not be round. It could be anything else, but not round. What would you do? Well, that's opening up the exploring way of thinking.
Right. And demystifying it, really, to help people understand what that kind of thinking is.
I think one of the things that we've learned from all of this is that the notion of thinking outside the box really means think outside your habitual way of thinking and your habitual way of perceiving. Now, normally we think of that as just, okay, we have to be bigger. But it's not necessarily bigger. It's being more versatile with all four styles.
Exactly. So for us, our definition and looking at think outside the box through the four styles, we find it to be much more strength-based, much more affirming and empowering, and actually does help people by becoming versatile, learning all four styles, learning the techniques of all four styles. It really does help people to think outside the box.
And if anyone has that notion that the exploring is the only style that thinks outside the box, it kind of pops that little balloon and says, no, exploring is not the only one who has that ability to think outside the box. In fact, they may not from our
way, from our definition.
But that all four styles, and therefore everyone has that capability in their own particular way.